Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we are going to analyze the Hindu dated 22nd of April 2020. Displayed on the screen is a list of articles that we are going to discuss today. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description of video. Let's begin our analysis. Page number 6 of today's newspaper presents a wonderful editorial which talks about futures shock. At the same time, page number 10 also talks about an important topic which deals with oil prices in negative terrain. Now, this topic is important from the perspective of prelims as there are many important terms which are involved here. At the same time, when we talk about the syllabus mapping, this topic is important from the perspective of international organizations and their impact on trade. Now let's first understand the context of the article. The context is the prices of West Texas Intermediate fell to minus $37.63 a barrel. So in this discussion, we'll be focusing on few things. First, what does the negative prices mean? Second important aspect is what are futures, which is also being discussed in the editorial part. At the same time, we'll be focusing on a key term which is called as contango. Next important aspect is what role oil futures have played in this price crash. Now we are aware of the fact that there is Brent oil as well. So when we talk about West Texas Intermediate, how West Texas Intermediate is affected more by such oil crisis, and Brent is immune to this, and hence we need to understand the difference between the two. Last but not the least, we'll be focusing on the likely consequences on India as well. So let's begin our analysis. So the first point of discussion is what is the meaning of negative prices? Now it would be difficult for you to believe that, but whatever you're imagining is correct in this scenario. It means that a seller would have to pay the buyer to hold the oil to be supplied. It means seller will pay not only for the oil but also for buying the oil. Now you might be thinking of a situation that why sellers are doing like that. Why can't they just throw the oil away or just dump it anywhere? At the same time, you would also be imagining that why it is not possible to cut the production. Now let's try to understand the situation one by one. Now when you talk about dumping oil somewhere, it means it is going to incur environmental loss. It means that if you're going to dump it somewhere, some environmental cost will be incurred on you. For example, spilling away the oil would cause grave damage to environment and ecosystem, and hence this is something which is out of question as well. You might also be thinking that there must be some mechanism of cutting down the production. But at the same time, you must know that when we talk about oil production, cutting them down in a short span of time is not possible as well as practical in nature. This is the reason why oil prices are defined by futures as well. Third important aspect is when oil is available for such a throwaway price, that is negative $37.6 per barrel, why can't countries buy more? Again, the reason is very simple. Most of the countries have some strategic reserves which are already full. At the same time, when we talk about the kind of economic activity which is going on, economic activity during the COVID-19 pandemic is on a downside. Now, since economic activity is on downside, so whatever oil the countries have already purchased, whether for their strategic resources or for their regular work, that is more than sufficient for them to last for another 3 to 6 months. So the countries would not like to invest their resources for something which they cannot hold as well. So in a nutshell, if we try to define why the prices are negative, first and foremost, the sellers are under obligation to sell the oil. Second important aspect is dumping the oil is not possible because of the environmental cost related to that. Third important aspect is the countries cannot buy more because their strategic reserves are already full, and moreover economic activity is also on a downturn. Another hidden aspect is that oil producing companies cannot practically reduce oil production in short term. So it means that oil is already available and now the buyer has to find a seller. Now let's try to understand the importance of futures as well. Now when we talk about the West Texas Intermediate oil is traded in the futures contract in the New York Mercantile Exchange. Now, this is where the traders buy and sell monthly futures, such as, for instance, May future or June future, and so on. So, it means that there is a future or a monthly future involved in this case. So, these intermediaries are under obligation to buy oil now, which they should deliver to people who are going to use or consume this oil. So, this brings us to the important and simple aspect. What does futures mean? Futures means that the seller of such futures will have to deliver a barrel of crude oil at a contracted or predefined price in the contracted month, just as the buyer will have to take the delivery at the contracted date. Now, there are intermediaries in these futures market who basically perform the task of being a broker in this aspect. They basically are a bunch of very smart people who keep on tracking the prices of crude oil, and based on that take business decision that what the price would be in the future as well. And based on that, they try to buy and sell the oil, thereby minting profit for themselves. Now, the point is that these intermediaries have the obligation to buy and then to sell. They cannot store themselves and they cannot dishonor the commitment that they have already entered. This is very important for their business and operations, and hence this situation has driven the prices to negative. Now, this brings us to the second important aspect. What are the main reasons for such a fall? The fall is caused by crash of futures. And in this context, let's try to understand the meaning of speculation first. Now, when we talk about the trading in commodities, there is a huge speculative participation in the oil futures trading as well. So, speculators buy and sell contract with no intention of taking delivery. What they basically will do, they will find buyers and ultimately ensure the delivery to these people. So these speculators have to get rid of their position on the contract expiry date. So let's try to understand the situation in a simple aspect. So there are oil companies and there are intermediaries. At the same time, at the bottom end, there are buyers as well. What these intermediaries normally commit to these oil companies, that they will buy oil at a future date and at a predefined price. Based on the feasibility of the speculation, oil companies accept the proposal, and based on that, they basically start producing. Now, it is the responsibility of intermediaries to find buyers, and in this process, they try to mint some brokerage for them. However, if buyers are not available, these intermediaries have to honor their obligation to their oil companies through the indexes, and that is what is causing the problem. If they fail to do so, they will have to take the physical delivery of crude oil on the contracted date. And since they do not have any kind of consumption lined up, nor they have the storage capacity, they actually cannot do this. So this actually helps us in understanding why the prices are now negative. So the speculators who did not want to take the delivery in May, because most of the world will be under the lockdown and hence demand would be at its minimum, proceeded to sell their positions, leading to massive fall in prices. This was because the future contract was set to expire today, and that is why the prices has plummeted to the negative level. Now in this context, let's try to understand what is contango trades. Now if you look at the price of futures now, we are talking about date 21, month is April. We can see that the projection is that the price of crude oil in the month of May would be $30 per barrel. It is expected to rise to around $20 by June. And if you talk about the November, the price is expected to go beyond $30 in the month of November. And this is what the contango trade is all about. The contango basically looks like a graph and basically shows the kind of projections these intermediaries normally use for the purpose of buying and selling. This particular situation is called as contango, which means that the spot prices that we see today are lower than the futures. This happens when traders expect a surge in the rise in the demand and value of the commodity higher for the future. We can see here the prices here are hovering at around $30. That is a negative. At the same time, in the future, the prices will go up and they will reach to around $20 in the month of June, and by November it is expected to recover to around $30. Now let's focus our attention to why this has happened or why this will happen in the future. First and foremost, it is expected that COVID-19 pandemic will be controlled in next 3 months and the economic activity will surge and will reach to the normal level by the end of this year, and hence the prices are expected to go up. Second important aspect is that traders also expect that storage space may be created or existing inventory is drawn out. Now we are aware of the fact that India and many other countries are under lockdown and hence economic activity is limited. So whatever strategic reserves or whatever reserves they have, they will utilize for some period of time and ultimately they need to buy in future because some part of economic activity is going on, and hence they expect that in the next 2 to 3 months the prices will be positive again. Third important aspect is that many countries have identified that this is a very good position and they are trying to increase their strategic reserves. You must be aware of the fact that United States has already increased its strategic reserves and India is also planning to do the same thing. Last but not the least is again is related Last but not the least, it is again related to the speculation only, since the contract expiry of 2 to 3 months of contracts is still weeks away, giving speculators that much more time to speculate. But at the same time, this particular graph may go up and down in the future as well. Now, the point that we need to understand that when we talk about Western Texas and Brent crude, why Brent crude price are not as devastated as WTI. And the reasons are very simple. First and foremost is the superior quality of the Brent crude. Now, when we talk about the Brent crude, it is basically drawn from the North Sea of the British coast, and the oil is considered to be of better quality as well. And since it is better quality, the cost of refining the crude oil is much less, and hence people normally resort to Brent crude more than the WTI. Second important aspect is that when we talk about Brent crude, it basically serves European Union as well as the entire Asia, where most of the developing countries which are very power hungry are situated. We can take example of China, India, Thailand and many other countries. The Brent crude basically serves to a considerably larger than that of United States in terms of demand. Another hidden aspect is that transporting oil from the US to Asia is not as economical, and hence there is a limitation in the scope of WTI grade. The last thing that we need to talk about is that when we talk about Brent futures, they can be settled in cash as well. Now we have seen that when we talk about WTI, the buyer has forced to take the physical delivery. However, in the case of Brent futures, the buyer is not forced to take physical delivery of oil but can settle the contract in cash as well. And this is the big difference between the WTI and Brent, which has ensured that Brent futures will not crash like that of WTI. So this is the entire contango situation that we need to understand. At the same time, we need to focus upon the two aspects of Brent crude and WTI. Now this brings us to the very important part of discussion is how is India benefiting from this price crash? First and foremost, it is giving India much relief in terms of import relief. The oil import bill, which falls sharply this fiscal year, giving tremendous relief to the government on external account front. But this does not mean relief in the current account deficit, as merchandise exports from India are also badly hit due to lockdown in the West. The situation would have benefited much more to India had India's export were not negatively impacted. But in the current scenarios, India's import as well as export have been negatively impacted, and hence there won't be any kind of relief in terms of current account deficit. Second important thing which is very important is to build up of strategic reserves. India is quietly building up its strategic reserves, taking advantage of the cheap prices. India has a capacity to hold over 39 billion barrels of oil at its strategic reserves in Vishakhapatnam, Mangalore and Padur near Udupi. So these are basically highlighted in terms of map. These are the two locations and one is in the Vishakhapatnam. And when we talk about these strategic reserves, these are basically underground salt caves which are converted and built to store the crude oil. So location of these strategic reserves is also very important from the perspective of examination. Page number 6 of today's newspaper presents a wonderful analysis that talks about the key strategy is fiscal empowerment of states. Now, as far as the topic is concerned, this is related more to polity and governance because of two specific counts. First, this topic highlights the importance of cooperative federalism in India. And second, it also talks about the fiscal empowerment of the states. In this context, we will try to understand all the major points which are highlighted by the author in this particular article. Now, we are aware of the fact that India and world over is suffering from COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the case of India, when we talk about COVID-19 can be dealt nicely only when center and state together work for a common goal. This particular common goal will be directed by one particular ideology, and that is cooperative federalism. Now, when we talk about cooperative federalism, we need to understand who is responsible for what part of responsibility. Now, when we talk about the Schedule 7 of the Constitution of India, public health and public order come under the purview of the state government. At the same time, when we talk about the central government, the central government role in terms of handling this pandemic should be limited to enabler, coordinator, and facilitator. Now, when we talk about the enabler aspect, it means it should strengthen the state government in their capacity and potential to fight against this disease. Second important aspect is coordinator because the states share boundaries with their neighboring state and hence the role of coordination is very important. Whenever state require a specific kind of facility, the center should facilitate that and that could be money, resources, testing kits or something which is similar to that. So we can see that center and state have predefined role and author through this particular article has focused on three interrelated dimensions. The author has focused on the first part, why state should take lead in the fight against COVID-19. Second important aspect that the author has highlighted is what are the various constraints before the state governments. And third important point, which is related to point number 1 and 2, what should be done in order to empower the states. We'll be focusing on all these three interrelated dimensions one by one. Let's turn our attention to the first question, why states should take lead in the fight against COVID-19. Now, in this context, we can see that there are two important aspects. First is the constitutional responsibility itself, and second, the need of a decentralized approach. Now, we are aware of the fact that when we talk about the Constitution of India, the basic idea which the constitutional makers put across was more of a federal in nature. And when we talk about federal nature, it is basically highlighted in the form of state list, union list, and concurrent list, which are highlighted in the Schedule 7 of the Constitution. Now, the important point is why these responsibilities in terms of public order and public health are being allocated to the state government. Now, this particular idea is based on principle of subsidiary. According to this principle, subject should be allocated to the level of government where it can be performed in the most efficient manner. Let's take a very simple example to understand that. Defense has been allocated to the union, whereas agriculture has been allocated to the state government. Now, it is needless to highlight that when we talk about agriculture, different states are in a better position to formulate the policies and implement the same at the ground level. However, when we talk about the defense need, central government is in a better position to mobilize resources. So in this context, two important aspects that we can highlight is the Schedule 7, where state list clearly mentions the state responsibility. And second, when we talk about the kind of work allocation that is done in the state list, it is also based on the principle of subsidiary. It simply implies that states are the better agency in terms of implementing program on the ground and fight against the COVID pandemic. Second important aspect, which is also related to this constitutional responsibility, is the need of a decentralized approach. Now, we need to understand that there's a need to adopt a decentralized approach to deal with this pandemic. Now, the reason for this is very simple, that there might be a need of staggered lifting of lockdown and easing of restriction to revive economic activities. At the same time, we have also seen that some states have done much better in terms of controlling the COVID-19 pandemic. In this particular case, you can also cite the case of Bhilwara model and recently the initiative taken by Odisha government in which village panchayat officials have been bestowed with the power of DCs. Now we can see that since states understand the specific needs of a particular region. At the same time, they are much better aware of the ground reality. They are better informed in terms of the ground realities, and hence a decentralized approach is a better fit to handle this kind of COVID pandemic. Now let us focus our attention to the various constraints before the state governments. Now, when we talk about the constraints that are highlighted by the author, these include first, current legal framework, second is decrease in revenue mobilization, and third is the limit on fiscal deficit under FRBM Act. Now, in this context, there are more things to be understood as well. Now, when we talk about the current constitutional and legal framework, there are some discrepancies as well. Now, when we talk about the constitutional framework, we are aware of the fact that public health is under the state list. So that is clearly mentioned. At the same time, center has powers only over preventing the spread of disease from one state to another, and this is mentioned in the entry 29 of the concurrent list. At the same time, when we talk about the Disaster Management Act, it empowers the center to take necessary action for the prevention and mitigation of the disaster. So this is what the primary work of Disaster Management Act is. At the same time, when we talk about the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897, this enables the states to take necessary action to prevent the outbreak or spread of dangerous epidemic disease. It limits the center's role to inspecting the ships in ports and detaining persons. So we can see that when we talk about the constitutional and legal framework, there are some points of dissonance as well. When we talk about the state list, it clearly highlights the role of the state. At the same time, the concurrent list, entry 29, also highlights the role of center. Similarly, in the Disaster Management Act, center gets sweeping powers. At the same time, when we talk about the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897, the role of the state is much more pronounced. So now let's try to understand the problems one by one. Let's focus on the Disaster Management Act of 2005. Now we are aware of the fact that the Parliament has enacted the Disaster Management Act of 2005 by invoking entry 23 of the concurrent list. According to the entry, it clearly mentions that social security and social insurance, employment and unemployment, even though all aspects of crisis management cannot be said to be covered in this entry. The reason for this is very simple. The disaster includes natural calamities, health-related disasters, that is epidemic, industrial disasters, and disasters caused by hostile elements such as terrorists. Some of the states have passed their own laws to deal with the disasters. So we can see that there is some amount of confusion which is available between the center and the state. At the same time, in this particular context, it is important to highlight the recommendation of the Second Administrative Reform Commission. According to one of the recommendations of the second ARC, there should be a separate entry of management of disasters and emergencies, natural or man-made, in the concurrent list. Unlike in other cases of proposal for inclusion in the concurrent list, state governments may also welcome this, as this will also enable them to have legislation without ambiguity regarding the entry. So we can see that in the current scheme of things, when we talk about the constitutional and legal framework, there are some points which actually go against each other. We have highlighted the importance of a state list as well as concurrent list. At the same time, there are some points of conflict in the Disaster Management Act as well as the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897. Now, this brings us to the important aspect in terms of the use of current legal framework. The center has invoked the Disaster Management Act of 2005 to impose a blanket lockdown throughout India. Now, in light of this announcement, sweeping guidelines were issued for the state governments to follow. However, even before the Disaster Management Act was invoked, several state governments had issued their powers under the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897. They have done this to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak. Although public order and public health are subject that lie with the states as per the Indian Constitution, the center has used the Disaster Management Act to effectively bypass states and assume complete control. This indicates a certain friction in the current legal framework when it comes to managing a crisis such as COVID-19, as the center and states do not appear to be in full sync. And this is what the author wants to highlight, that the kind of cooperative federalism that we want to see in terms of handling any crisis seems to be absent in this particular case. Now, the third point that the author highlights in this entire scheme of things is the decrease in the revenue mobilization. Now, we are aware of the fact that state governments are required to provide fiscal stimulus to counter this pandemic. However, they are severely constrained in their revenue mobilization on account of following reasons. The first such reason is the decrease of their own tax collection. Now, because of the lockdown which was imposed on the nationwide scale, there has been a demand supply disruption. And this has led to large scale fall in the revenue collection of the states. Now, in order to highlight this, we can take an example where Karnataka state government projected that they will be collecting around 12,000 crores in this month. At the same time, the current realization is even less than rupees 300 crores. So we can see that the kind of problem COVID-19 has caused, it has an economic impact as well. And this has led to decrease in tax collection of the state, and this will limit their capability to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Second important aspect, which is equally relevant in this case, is decrease in tax devolution from the center to states. Now, according to the 15th Finance Commission, the center is required to transfer 41% of the total central divisible pool to the states in accordance to its recommendation. The decrease in the total taxes collected by the center due to COVID-19 would lead to decrease in the central divisible pool and hence adversely affect the tax devolution from the center to the states. It is estimated that total tax devolution to the states in 2020-21 would be 2.2 lakh crores, lower than the Finance Commission estimates. And this is a significant situation that we need to take into account. Another very significant aspect which is limiting states' potential to fight COVID-19 pandemic is the limits imposed on fiscal deficit under the FRBM Act. The FRBM Act, formulated by respective state governments, required them to maintain fiscal deficit of 3% of their state's GDP. The disruption caused by COVID-19 is unprecedented in nature, and hence state governments would be required to provide fiscal stimulus through borrowing. Hence, the fiscal deficit limit imposed under FRBM Act constrains the ability of the state government to deal with the pandemic. Now, this brings us to the most important part of discussion: what should be done in order to handle this situation. The first suggestion that comes to our mind is that state government must be enabled to provide fiscal stimulus by enhancing fiscal deficit limit to 5% of the state's GDP. As already mentioned, according to the limit imposed through FRBM Act, fiscal deficit cannot exceed 3% for the state's GDP. Second important aspect is the state government must be allowed to approach the Finance Commission and ask for the supplementary report. We are aware of the fact that there will be a decrease in their own tax collection. At the same time, there will be a decrease in the tax devolution from the center to the state as well. In this context, it is important for the state to bring Finance Commission into picture and then relook at the expenditure commitments of the state governments to deal with the pandemic and give appropriate recommendations. Third important aspect is investment in the healthcare sector. Now, when we talk about the COVID-19, it has actually exposed the historical neglect of the healthcare sector in the country. The total public expenditure in the center and states on health is hardly around 1.5% of GDP. The central sponsored schemes, the National Health Mission, is inadequately funded with lack of autonomy for the states. Similarly, the focus of Ayushman Bharat has been to advocate insurance rather than building wellness centers. Hence, the health crisis imposed by COVID-19 must be seen as an opportunity to address various flaws of the healthcare system. So this is the entire summary of the analysis which was presented by the author. Page number 7 of today's newspaper highlights a very important article which focuses on a change in migrant policy. Now, we know that India is a developing country, and in a developing country, the migration is a natural corollary. So there is a migration from urban to urban and rural to urban. At the same time, when we talk about the COVID-19 crisis, it has brought to forefront the issue surrounding to migration in India, particularly during a disaster. In this context, this article actually analyzes the structural flaws in migration policy in India and emphasizes on the need to bring a change in migration policy. In this context, the authors have highlighted importance of migration issue during a disaster. Second important aspect is adequacy of relief measures. And third, whatever we have learned during this COVID-19 epidemic, what is the way forward for that? Now let's focus on each of these issues one by one. So the first issue at hand is importance of migration issues during disaster. Now, whenever we try to understand the importance of migration, we have to understand the nature and scope of the problem at hand. In this context, the numbers are huge, especially in case of India. Now, according to the 64th NSSO and Census 2011 data, there are approximately 2 million daily wage workers. The authors have taken example from the state of Bihar, in which out of 123 million population, the number of rural-urban migrants constitute about 10 million. And when we add the interstate migrant, it will add another 3 million. Now, the point that authors want to highlight that when we are talking about such huge numbers, specifically from a particular state, then in the situation of lockdown which was caused by COVID-19, these migrants pose bigger problem. Now, authors highlight that this particular huge number, specifically from particular state, poses a big challenge of logistic problems. It is actually very difficult to move these number of people from one place to another. At the same time, even when these people are staying in a lockdown, then arranging for food and shelter for these people is going to be a challenge. Now, in this case, the authors highlight that we are talking about one particular situation of Bihar. At the same time, when we talk about UP, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, and many other states, this problem is compounded to many times over. Second problem that authors have defined is the high dependency on these migrant population. Now we know that as cities grow in size and population, they become heavily dependent on the services of migrant workers. And this relates to multiple sectors as well, like construction, garment, manufacturing, mining, and agriculture. In a nutshell, when we are talking about high dependency rate, the dependency rate is across all the sectors, whether we talk about skilled workers, semi-skilled or unskilled. Now, when we talk about the migration that we have seen, the kind of movement these people have done, this has brought all the industries in this area to a standstill. And this has basically stopped the economic engines from moving forward. Third important problem that authors highlight relates to lack of alternate source of livelihood for these migrant population. Now, when these migrant people are working in the urban centers, they are in a position to maintain themselves and their family. At the same time, when they go back to their places, their employability becomes questionable. So when we talk about the kind of impact COVID-19 had, the reverse migration to the source state is a huge problem, as there is not enough alternate source of livelihood for these workers. Besides, for the source state, it also amounts to loss of income that comes in the form of remittance. So we can see that when we talk about lack of alternate resources, it is not only the problem of these migrant laborers, but also it also causes a heavy burden on the state exchequer as well, which is the host. Next important aspect is the spread of disease. Now we have seen that COVID-19 epidemic is very contagious in nature, and hence the practice of social distancing and quarantine is basically used so that the spread of the disease can be stopped. However, when we talk about migrant population, they basically travel in large numbers in which these practices of social distancing cannot be properly practiced. Hence, in the case of epidemic, the exodus of seasonal migrants create apprehensions about the spread of disease in the source states. And we can see that many states have tried measures to maintain the migrant population in those states only. And they have discouraged these migrant population to go back to their native states. The last point that authors highlight is the poor condition itself. For those migrants who choose to stay back in their places of work face severe issue of poor living condition, as most of them live in slum colonies which lack sanitation, hygiene, safe drinking water and health services, etc. So here we can see that the migrant population needs to be controlled. They need to stay in the state where they are staying. They need to stay in the state where they are working so that the spread of disease can be controlled. At the same time, since they have poor economic condition, it is very difficult for them to stay in the state which is acting as the host for them. So in this way, we can see that the population, that is huge numbers. Second, high dependencies of cities on this migrant labor. Third, lack of alternate sources of livelihood for the people who migrate back to their native state. Fourth, the chances of spread of disease. And fifth, even when people are not going back, these migrants live in a very poor condition, which makes them more vulnerable to disease and other problems. The next point that the author highlights is the adequacy of the relief packages. Now we need to understand that whenever we talk about COVID-19 pandemic, we know that the focus of the government is in terms of the relief measures to the poorer sections of society. At the same time, it is also understood that these measures are still inadequate to deal with the issue of migrants. Now there are few basic reasons that we need to understand. First, we know that the migrants have remained in the cities are unable to get benefits from the additional food grains as they are registered under the PDS in their source states. Now, one of the primary focus of the government was to ensure that the migrant population do not go back to their native states and they should stay in the state in which they were working. At the same time, the kind of benefits we see are rolled out through the mechanism of the state. Now, when we talk about these kind of benefits, these migrant population cannot take the benefit as they are not registered in these states, and hence this particular initiative had a very limited impact on migrants. Second, in order to provide some relief to the migrant workers, the Manrega wages have been increased. At the same time, these have not benefited the migrant labor who have not returned back to their source states. So whatever increase that has been promised through Manrega wages has not benefited in any sense. At the same time, the attendance rate in terms of Manrega work is very limited as well. Third important aspect that author highlights is that given the low rate of registration, they are deprived from the benefits of cess funds, of building and other construction welfare fund. Now, most of the people who are migrant in nature are migrant labor and they are unskilled in nature, and hence they do not have enough information available to them through which they can get themselves registered for various kind of schemes. And hence the benefit that we need to deliver to this migrant population is again very limited. So we can see that these three features: first, lack of registration of migrant workers in the state they are working; second, increase in Manrega wages has not benefited these migrant workers; and third, the low rate of registration has actually questioned the inadequacy of the relief package itself. So what needs to be done? Authors highlight in terms of the way forward. Authors highlight that the migrant policy of India needs a structural revamp. And this is basically done to address both short-term distress and initiate long-term measures such as first, the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme. This scheme was earlier announced by Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution in February, and this should be rolled out without any further delay. This will ensure that wherever the people are, they can get ration through PDS shops, and for this particular purpose, they are not dependent in the state where they are registered. Second important aspect is scaling up sector-specific registration of migrant workers and setting up dedicated relief fund under each sector. Now we are aware of the fact that there are unskilled or semi-skilled people who do not get themselves registered, and hence we need to take right action in this direction. Since we are aware of the problem, and hence we need to orient our efforts in this particular direction. Third important aspect is distribution of food without ration card in municipalities. Now in this case, authors have also quoted the case of Delhi where this step has been done. Apart from these, there should be provisions of night shelters in the cities with adequate living conditions. And last but not the least, compulsory cash transactions from employers to employee every month. In this fashion, we would have ensured that the migrant population is taken care of in this time of distress. Page number 7 of today's newspaper talks about a topic which says that ill-equipped to deal with crisis. Now, in this particular article, the author has highlighted that COVID-19 has laid bare the science policy deficit. Now, in this context, we'll be focusing on author's perspective, who has highlighted that loopholes and deficit in science policy making in India had ill effects on ability of India to deal with crises such as COVID-19. Now, in this context, the author has highlighted many reasons for that. The first such reason is the low investment in science and technology. Now, it is important to highlight that most of the countries in the developed world and developing countries as well spend a significant portion of their money in terms of investment in the field of R&D and science and technology. In this particular scenario, it is important for us to quote that China spends around 2.1% of its GDP on science and technology. And if we talk about developed country like US spends at around 2.8% of the GDP. So this kind of investment is basically instrumental in propelling these developing as well as developed countries into a league of countries which can handle any kind of problem. So the author highlights that the kind of ill preparedness that we have shown in terms of handling COVID-19 pandemic comes from loopholes and deficit in our science policy. And for this particular purpose, the investment in this particular field is very important. Second important point that author has highlighted is low access to data. Now it is more of a paradox that India is a service sector based economy and most of its service sector is basically fueled by information technology companies. Still, we face the problem of low access of data. In order to make any kind of informed data driven policy decision and follow up action, the kind of data that we require, India lacks that. And this is the second reason which the author highlights in terms of loopholes or deficit in the science policy making. Third important aspect that author highlights is the poor policy decisions. Author has quoted that many decisions which are taken by Government of India are without any sound scientific or environmental consideration. For this particular purpose, author highlights the case of Karnataka government decision to continue with the proposal of Hubballi-Ankula railway line through the last remaining forest of Western Ghats. We know that Western Ghats are environmentally sensitive zone, and in this consideration, considering such kind of project in this area is not a very wise thing to do. And this shows that we have a poor policy decisions as well, which basically make this entire situation even worse. So what this has resulted into, we can see that there is low investment, there is low access of data, at the same time there is poor policy decision. The result is very simple. According to author, India has become a hotspot for emerging diseases. As already mentioned, the paradox that is related to India is that India is an information technology based economy. At the same time, this information technology, big data, and informatics is not basically utilized to understand the environmental challenges, infectious disease such as COVID, and hence India is suffering. And this is the reason why author says that India has become a hotspot for emerging diseases. The next problem which is caused by inadequate science policy leads to complex social environmental problems. Now we are aware of the fact that India is a huge country where the population is going to touch 1.4 billion soon. At the same time, there is a lot of economic and social disparity. Now in such a scenario, COVID-19 type of pandemic push people into poverty and are not understood properly, as it requires integrating natural and social sciences to generate multidimensional knowledge. This particular situation leads to increasing number of people who are in the marginal group. These people are highly vulnerable, and if adequate measures are not taken in time, then this problem may go beyond repair as well. So what can be done in such a scenario? First, the author is hopeful that all is not lost and there are some hopeful signs as well. In this particular case, the author has highlighted that India has 9 large national science missions in the various stage of implementation. And hence, it would be too immature to conclude that India's initiative in the field of policy of science is inadequate as well. The author also highlights that mission on quantum computing through National Mission on Quantum Technologies and Application, on biodiversity, that is National Biodiversity Mission, etc., are simply exemplary in nature. At the same time, author highlights that there is more that we need to do in this particular regard. Now this brings us to the last point of discussion, what more can be done, and author highlights the following 3 steps. First is to increase the investment in the field of science, which is directed towards the well-being of social sector. So in this sense, we can see that the author is trying to relate social issues with that of scientific inquiry. And author is of the opinion that problem of many social issues lies with the scientific temperament, and this is what the author wants to highlight. The author also highlights that India should focus on the realization of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, we need to pay attention to our environmental factors as well, because environmental disasters are going to be the next big problems that India may face in the time to come if we do not pay attention to this particular aspect. The next important aspect that author wants to highlight is to provide new data directly to the policymakers. In this case, author is of the opinion that we should undertake rigorous testing, monitoring, and modeling to inform policy and action for successful mitigation of COVID-19. At the same time, when we do such kind of exercises, this will help us in developing models which can be utilized for solving bigger and other problems. In the time to come, there would be problems which are of environmental nature, there would be problems which would be disease like, and there will be social economic problems as well. In this particular context, these kind of model development helps us in providing help to the right set of people, and that too efficiently. The last important point that author highlights is to take steps to ensure healthcare as an individual basic right and earth care as a collective right. Now, in this particular sense, the author clearly highlights that taking care of earth, environment, and our surrounding is as important as taking care of the healthcare, and both cannot be separated in their identity. And that is what the perspective of author is, that when we define socioeconomic problems, environmental problems, and try to solve them through data-driven approach, we come up with a system which is far more efficient and effective in terms of providing relief. At the same time, it will also stop such problems from occurring at the very first place as well. Page number 1 of today's newspaper talks about a very important topic that deals with Indian Council of Medical Research asks states to stop using rapid tests for the next 2 days. But at the same time, the reliability of these test kits in terms of proper results hovers from around 7% to 61%. This is not a very good sign considering the fact we are trying to control COVID-19 pandemic. Now here in this context, it is important for us to know that what is rapid test. At the same time, from the perspective of coming prelims examination, we should also know what are immunoglobulins. Now when we talk about the rapid test is also called as immunoglobulin test, which measures the level of type of antibodies in the blood. Now you must be aware of the fact that immune system of human body makes antibodies which basically protect the body against bacteria, virus and other allergens. The body makes different antibodies or immunoglobulins to fight different things. Now this can be understood in a simple example that antibody of chickenpox is not going to be the same as antibody for say hepatitis. Now here it must also be highlighted that sometimes the body may even mistakenly make antibody against itself, treating healthy organs and tissue as foreign invaders. This is called as autoimmune disease. So coming back to our discussion on rapid test. Now how this rapid test basically works? This test basically works by identifying or detecting the IgM and IgG that are specifically generated by the body in response to the COVID-19 infection. Now it is important here to understand that IgM and IgG fight infection by targeting specific antigens on the surface of COVID-19 virus. One of the significant attributes of these tests is the report can be generated in 10 to 15 minutes. And hence it is a very fast mechanism to identify who is infected by COVID-19. Now in this context, we should also know more about immunoglobulins. As we have already mentioned, immunoglobulins are type of antibodies. And these are basically classified into 5 following varieties, that is IgA, that is immunoglobulin A. Now when you talk about these immunoglobulins A, they are found in the lining of the respiratory tract and digestive system. They are also found in saliva, tears and breast milk. Next is immunoglobulin G, that is IgG. This is the most common form of antibody found in the blood and other body fluids. This protects human body against bacterial as well as viral infection. Third is immunoglobulin M, that is IgM. It is important for you to know that this is the first antibody the body makes when it fights a new infection. Even when you talk about COVID-19, detection of IgM is a significant part of rapid testing. Now, IgM is basically found in blood and lymph fluids. Third is IgE, that is immunoglobulin E. Now, normally these are found in small amounts in the blood. However, there may be higher amounts when the body overreacts to allergens or is fighting an infection from a parasite. So, it means that their presence may increase or decrease depending upon the presence of parasite or allergen. Last is immunoglobulin D. Now, this is something which is more of a mysterious antibody that we have identified. Now, this is least understood antibody with only small amounts in the blood. Now, when we talk about these antibodies are very important from the perspective of coming prelims examination, and you should keep a note of all of them. Now, here it is important to understand that when we talk about the COVID-19, immunoglobulin M, that is IgM, which is the first antibody that human body generates, and second is immunoglobulin G, that is the second antibody that COVID-19 detects. So presence of these two antibodies basically help us in identifying whether a person is suffering from COVID-19 or not. On the page number 7, there is an article which talks about putting Sagar vision to test. Now, this article is important from the perspective of understanding what is Indian Ocean Commission, what are its member countries, and what are their respective locations. For example, we can talk about Seychelles, we can talk about Madagascar, Comoros, Reunion Island, and Mauritius. Now, this particular news has been covered in detail on 7th of March 2020 when India became an observer in the Indian Ocean Commission. This issue has been discussed in detail. At the same time, there are some aspects of Sagar vision which are also related with the Indian Ocean Commission. Now, in the PDF of this video, we have put across everything that is related from the perspective of Sagar vision along with the Indian Ocean Commission. At the same time, it is highly recommended that you go back and watch DNS of 7th of March 2020, which was done by Nagendra sir, and go through this analysis once again in terms of identifying important location, member countries, and the constitution of this commission in terms of 1982, 1984, and the Victoria Agreement. With this, we have come to the question of the day. The question of the day is: consider the following statements about immunoglobulins. Statement number 1 is IgM is the first antibody the body makes when it fights a new infection. Second statement is immunoglobulin A or IgA is found in the lining of respiratory tract and digestive system as well as saliva, spit and tears. Which of the statement given above is are correct? Option A is 1 only, option B is 2 only, option C is both 1 and 2, option D is neither 1 nor 2.